Welcome to Energy Frontier, the Wyoming Landscape Podcast. Hosted by Dr. Holly Krutka, Executive Director of the School of Energy Resources at the University of Wyoming. The show highlights SER's role supporting our mission to promote energy-driven economic development for the state of Wyoming.
So welcome back, listeners. As a top natural gas producing state, it's really important that Wyoming identify and determine new ways to detect and curb methane emissions. We're ensuring that the state of Wyoming maintains a strong energy industry in the face of mounting regulatory requirements on greenhouse gas emissions and really methane in particular. Today, I'm really excited to interview Professor Shane Murphy. He's director of the Center for Air Quality, which we'll talk about more. And that center tackles many different air quality issues in Wyoming and nationally on everything from wildfires to ozone and much more. So would really encourage you to explore their website if you're interested. Today, we're going to focus more on energy, but they do so much great work. So welcome so much, Shane. Thank you for joining us on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So let's start by having you tell our listeners about your background and how you came to work at the University of Wyoming. You're in the Department of Atmospheric Science and the College of Engineering and Physical Sciences. You're also, as I mentioned, the director of SER Center for Air Quality. So tell us about all those different roles you hold.
Yeah, well, so I actually started as a chemical engineer. So all my degrees are in chemical engineering. And when I went to grad school, I didn't really know what I wanted to do. And I ended up really liking atmospheric science. So I spent my graduate years and my postdoc years studying aerosols, actually, which are like what people typically think of pollution being when you see a polluted sky. And then when I came to Wyoming, it became clear that there was an ozone problem in the Upper Green River Basin. So we started working on that. And then we kind of meandered into methane emissions because a lot of regulatory agencies, as you mentioned, in the federal and state level are trying to mitigate methane emissions. And so we've been working on that for about a decade now.
And you have done so much good work, and I can't wait to dive into those. So for folks who don't know, the Green River Basin is over on the western side of the state. It's where today about 90% of Wyoming's natural gas is produced. There's tons of industry engagement. But before we get into that, let's focus a little bit more on your career. So I noticed in your bio, you've done fellowships for NASA and a postdoc at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. So can you tell us a little bit about those and how they impacted your career?
Yeah, sure. So my fellowship for NASA was during grad school, and I actually got to come out to Colorado and fly on some of the aircraft here. And so that impacted my career in a lot of ways because now I work a lot with aircraft. So our department actually operates an aircraft, and we do a lot of studies on that. And then at NOAA, I worked more with aerosols and different field projects. And so I think both those fellowships really got me into field work. And so that has benefited me a lot here at University of Wyoming. We spend a lot of time in the field measuring things. So
the center and the department have a plane with all kinds of sensors for air quality, but actually your department also flies the UW plane.
Yes.
Yes. So you guys have lots of different jobs in that department. I'm very appreciative. And by the way, I'm not the best flyer. So your pilots, your faculty pilots, or your researchers, they're phenomenal in lots of different ways and for putting up with me. So appreciate that. You can take that back to them.
Our pilots are great. Our whole staff is great. And yeah, they spend half the time flying around with instruments in the back of the plane and half the time flying around with VIPs like yourself.
Oh my gosh. I don't know about that. Okay. So for students and graduates that might be considering a fellowship like the ones you've done, what would you tell them about the benefits and challenges?
Yeah, I think it's just go for it. They're really competitive, so they're hard to get. But if you get the opportunity, it allows you to work with a whole spectrum of people and do stuff that you're not normally doing in everyday life. So yeah, it was great for me. I really enjoyed them.
Great. Okay, so you and I, you already mentioned this. We both received our PhDs in chemical engineering and undergrads in chemical engineering.
Yep.
So you already talked about it a little bit. Tell me a little bit more detail about what did you study in your PhD, like related to aerosols?
Yeah, so we spent our time looking at emissions, actually. So I spent some time looking at emissions from farms, emissions from boats, and then we actually spent a lot of time looking at how those emissions impact clouds. So it turns out when you emit aerosol particles, they make clouds brighter, and that can have a big impact on the climate. It's one of our biggest uncertainties about climate change. So
interesting.
That's what we studied.
So as director for the Center of Excellence for Air Quality, What's the main focus areas of the center? We've mentioned a few. Maybe you can go into a little bit more detail about the wide array of things that you all work on.
Yeah, so the Center for Air Quality is really focused on any air quality issue related to energy in Wyoming. And really, we're lucky. We live in a state that has great air quality, so we don't have tons of these. So we have actually ended up focusing mostly on ozone in the Upper Green River Basin. They've had some ozone issues. And then methane has been a big concern nationally and locally. And so people are trying to figure out ways to emit less methane that makes natural gas a cleaner fuel, basically, if you can avoid leaking methane. So those are the two big focuses.
And so you have extensive experience working with methane emissions detection and measurement. Can you describe the challenges you face measuring methane emissions and how it's evolved in the oil and gas, and particularly natural gas industry, who you've worked with really closely over the years? Yeah,
there are a lot of challenges. We're fortunate. Most of our projects have been with industry lately, and so that really helps us. Initially, our challenges were our projects were independent of industry, and so we were always trying to figure out what they were doing on site, and that's a real challenge because it's a complicated industry. And so lately, we've really been working hand in hand with industry, and that has helped a lot. Other challenges are just methane's hard to detect. It's a small molecule. There are a lot of sensors. The sensors are really expensive. Most of the stuff we drive around with is worth hundreds of thousands of dollars just to figure out how much methane is there. And then I think the third big challenge has really been going from, there's methane to how much methane that is, right? So I can detect a lot of methane walking by my natural gas stove, but that doesn't mean it's a huge emitter.
Right.
And so I have to figure out how to go from those concentrations into how many kilograms that site is emitting. And that's a real challenge that we still work on every day.
So let's talk a little bit about your work with natural gas producers. I think it's an opportunity we have here at the School of Energy Resources and more broadly at the University of Wyoming that we get to work with industry more closely than maybe other institutions. Part of it is just unique to Wyoming's smallness. I think the other part is our industry partners are really interested in working with the university. So talk about how your work with industry, the energy sector, and particularly natural gas producers in Wyoming, how did that start?
Yeah, so we were actually out doing a project. I can't remember who even sponsored that project. It was probably a federal grant from the EPA. And we were just out measuring from public roadways, and very conscientiously, one of our partners who now we've worked with for a decade just came out and asked if we wanted a safety briefing to make sure we had all the right personal protective equipment. And we said, sure, because that's great. And so we went to their site and they told us about all the PPE we could have. We didn't have our full set of PPE. We were driving on public roads, so we were okay, but they were recommending we get all this. And actually, they volunteered to loan us a bunch. They loaned us some jumpsuits, and it was great. And from then on, we just worked with them beautifully ever after. So it started just as a safety check by one of their people out in the field and has turned into a great collaboration.
So you were kind of driving around their site, trying to figure out what was happening in terms of emissions.
Yep.
And they really invited you in.
Absolutely.
First to make sure you were protected.
First to make sure we were being safe. But I think our experience with all the operators we've worked with is they really want to reduce their own emissions. Mm-hmm. They're not interested in, it's bad for many reasons. It's bad because it's bad for the climate, but it's also bad for they lose money every kilogram they leak.
Well, they lose money. And actually, when you first started working with the producers, if I understand it correctly, they were having ozone events. They were going to be shut down. They would not be operating today if they had not figured out where those emissions that were causing ozone were coming from and had closed them. So, today, Wyoming producers that work has really led to them having the lowest methane intensity in the western U.S. of any state west of the Mississippi. And there's a lot of natural gas production west of the Mississippi. So that's a big statement. But it all started with detecting those VOCs, volatile organic compounds that were causing ozone. And then the work has just continued. The collaboration has continued since then.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a huge shout out to the Wyoming DEQ in line there because they went out and were one of the first DEQs to put in they did it as a bank. So each company got a certain amount of VOC emissions, like you say, and they got a certain amount of NOx emissions. And those are kind of the two pieces. NOx comes from like automobiles or drill rigs. Whenever you have a combustion engine, you get NOx. Mm-hmm. And so they had to figure out how to balance those, and they had allocated amounts of each, and the companies really worked hard to reduce both. And they're just in an unfortunate situation. So they're actually, it's some of the, like you said, some of the cleanest natural gas that's produced in the country. Unfortunately, they live in a basin that's between two mountain ranges where the meteorology just makes all those emissions stick in like the first 100 feet above your head. And so they're in an unfortunate situation there, but they've managed to really mitigate it. And they've come out of, for a while, they were in non-attainment with the EPA standard for ozone, and they've managed to come out of that and have stayed out of that. So
it's a true success story.
Yeah.
And the fact that they're not huge companies that have their own big research departments that could buy a plane and all the sensors that you have in your van, and it's been such a success story. So can you talk a little bit about how you've collaborated them and the work that was done with the producers in a little more detail?
Yeah, so we collaborated with some companies up in the Upper Green, and we've actually collaborated all over the United States.
Yeah.
And especially in Colorado and Wyoming. Those, I think, have been our biggest focus areas, but we've done a lot of work in Utah, and we've been everywhere from California to Arkansas. And so in all these projects, really, it's just been various different ways of figuring out what's emitting, why is it emitting, and how do we reduce it. And I think what we've really learned over the last decade is people used to think oil and gas was pretty easy. You have so many valves, so many, separators, and each one you would just assign an emission factor. So this valve will leak X% of the methane that goes through it. And that's how people did it. And that's still how people do it. And so that's called an emission inventory. And what we've learned over the last decade is that is not a good way to represent oil and natural gas, because oil and natural gas tends to be a lot more like traffic on the street than it does a machine that operates the same every time. So if you go and you look at vehicles in like Los Angeles, you find out that the vast majority of the pollution comes from about 10% of the cars. And these are the ones you see driving down the road where they're just broken, right? They're not working right. And oil and gas is kind of the same way. We see that a huge fraction of the emissions comes from malfunctions, not these standard emissions. And so over the last decade, we've learned that. We've learned how to model that. And then people now have really figured out how to mitigate that. And so now we're seeing the emissions come much more in line with the spreadsheet, what you think it should be emitting, which is a much smaller number than when you have these malfunctioning sites.
Mm-hmm. So I have a question for you. Why are emissions so high in certain basins, like the Permian versus Wyoming? What causes that to be so different? Is it just the amount of production, or what's happening?
Yeah, that's still kind of the $1 million question. What I think we know now is that basins like the Permian, they have some very large emissions that are very rare. So when you fly, a lot of people have flown aircraft over the Permian and satellites. And what you see a handful of these huge emissions. So you'll see an emission that's emitting several tons per hour of methane. And we're still trying to figure out what causes these very large emissions, but that seems to be a huge part of the reason. So if you fly over like the Denver-Julesburg Basin or the Upper Green River Basin, you don't see these huge events. And so we're still trying to figure out why are the operations different, what all is going on there, and we're trying to resolve that. But I think for the most part, we can say as we cut down on these very large emissions, we see an overall decrease in emissions. And then beyond that, I think there's just operational methods, right? Our producers in the Upper Green in Wyoming are really conscientious. They do a lot to try to mitigate leaks. They visit their sites very often. They fly over their sites with various sensors. They have laser sensors going in the basin. So they're doing a lot to try to make sure they don't have any leaks.
And so, I want to tell a little story about the time you met Director Reagan. He's director of the EPA, the federal EPA. And he was here touring the state of Wyoming and learning about different energy production and environmental protection steps that have been taken in the state. And we met with him, and he asked you, he's been hearing that emission estimates are way too low and that methane emissions across the country are much higher than what is being reported. And he asked what you thought about that. Do you remember what you said?
I don't remember what I said.
I remember what you said.
What did I say?
You said, sir, that might be true, but it's not true here in Wyoming. We have a pretty good handle on our methane emissions here in the state.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. I think that's true in a number of areas. I think that's true in Colorado too. So certainly 10 to 15 years ago, methane emissions were definitely much, much higher than what's in the inventory. We did a project in 2018 in the Permian Basin where we estimated that the emissions in the Permian were 5 to 10 times higher than what was in the inventory. And other groups actually thought we were way low. So, 10 or more times more methane coming out than what people thought. And I think
they thought you were low?
Yeah,
wow.
Yeah. So that's a conservative estimate. So the inventory is still quite a bit off in regions like that. In Wyoming, we've actually found that our measurements are lining up pretty well with inventory. They're still, 20, 30% off, but that's not a big deal in this business. And I think Colorado's also, we've found in our last couple of projects, getting towards that range. They're 20, 30% different. So we're really trying to tweak those. So what we see now is, kind of a decade ago, everybody was high. And what we see now is we're having pockets of places, Wyoming, Colorado, that seem to match up pretty well with inventories. And I think those pockets are growing and growing. And that's just the goal, is to have everybody be operating in a way that we understand and that we have the right emissions for.
And that really benefits our industry too, because they're required to report these.
Yep.
And so they have pretty strong backing and confidence in the numbers they're reporting.
Yeah, I think it benefits industry in a few ways. They're required right now. They have to report their emissions. It's pretty clear that as regulations move on, there are going to start to be some penalties for these emissions. In Colorado, there's already penalties for these emissions. And nationwide, there's what's kind of sometimes referred to as a methane tax going on board in the next couple of years. And so that will punish operators that emit more than a certain amount of methane intensity. So it helps them that way, but it also provides a business opportunity, right? There are a lot of states, California and others, who are much more interested in purchasing your methane if you can prove that your emissions are lower than other people's.
And that's something our producers have started really working on. I know both Pure West and Jonah have had structured deals that has allowed them to get paid more for their natural gas based on having a lower methane intensity. And that's really important for Wyoming. So we used to ship gas all over the country, but we really don't anymore. With the Marcellus and the Bakken and new natural gas production, even the Permian, now Wyoming's gas pretty much goes west. It goes to Nevada, it goes to Washington, Oregon, and California. And those states, especially the three on the West Coast, are ratcheting down their emissions. And over time, we're hoping that will be more common, that they'll place a premium. So you've talked about a stick, a methane tax, but there's also a carrot. Now, you have to have very rigorous proof that you're actually reducing your emissions and you have a lower methane product. And that's what our producers are working toward. And I think the work you're doing also is really important to that. So
yeah, no, I think that's right. I think sometimes people forget that Wyoming produces a lot of energy, but the vast majority of our energy just gets shipped out. So it's something to keep in mind as we work. It's not necessarily about what emissions Wyoming wants. It's about what emissions the states that we're shipping this to wants.
Yeah.
And so it's really important for our producers to meet those goals, because then where we're sending it out is much more interested in buying it.
Right. Yep. And it's kind of early days in those markets, but we are starting to see movement. And just to give a plug for our Center for Energy Regulation and Policy Analysis, has done a paper that you can get on their website on the business side of lower methane intensity natural gas and how it can help Wyoming and where those markets are and what the state can do in addition to supporting your center and your collaboration with industry, what we can do as a state to help continue to bring awareness and take actions to support that continued sale of natural gas. So what advancements on the technology side do you see coming into the future to assist with what you're doing now?
Yeah, so from our point of view, from making measurements, we see a lot of technology improvements. So just in the last 5 years, we've gone from these instruments costing $100,000 a piece to measure methane down to about $30,000 is still very expensive, but that's a huge improvement. And I think as we look to the future, the sensors on the ground are getting really cheap. So we're hoping they're going to get in the few $1,000s range. And people are talking about how we can put these at every site maybe, or we can have them on vehicles that drive around in the oil field. And then you also see satellites really advancing. So EDF, which is an Environmental Defense Fund, just launched a satellite called MethaneSat that's hoping to look globally and figure out where all the methane emissions are so we can mitigate them. So I think some people are really excited about this. Some people are a little scared about what they might find with their satellite. But I think in the end, that'll be a good thing. And then on the oil and gas side, we see just massive improvements from the industry. They're changing everything about how they operate to reduce emissions. And so we see them going tankless at some sites, they call it. So they're getting rid of their tanks, or they're doing really advanced ways of mitigating emissions. So if you ever go by the Upper Green River Basin, you'll see a whole lot of these, what they call emission control devices is kind of an internal flare. So everywhere they think they might be a leak, they make sure they burn off the methane before it gets released. And so I think we see just a huge jump by the industry going from, it's one thing that actually challenges us. We try to quantify emissions, and we find it takes us 2 to 3 years to get a good handle on the measurements we made. And by then, they've changed everything.
And you have to start over.
We have to start over. So it's job security,
Good.
I guess.
Job security.
Yeah.
And talk about, what are you doing with your drone? It's really cool.
Yeah.
It's pretty big.
Yeah, we bought a drone from a company in Montana, and it's a big drone, and we're going out there and actually using that to quantify emissions. And some of the producers in both Wyoming and Colorado are also using drones to overfly their sites. So it's very exciting, and it's a little nerve-wracking, right, to have $100,000 of stuff flying around in the air.
Right.
But,
don't let the battery run out.
Yeah, don't let the battery run out. But it's been successful so far. It's fun.
Good. Okay, we've talked a lot about Wyoming. Can you talk a little bit about your collaborative project with CSU, Colorado State University?
Yeah, I can. So there's a few collaborative projects we've done with them. Actually, we've worked with them on several projects. And the latest one is one called SABRE that's funded by the Department of Energy. And so really there we are trying to fully understand the emissions. So we have a network of towers, and then we go out on the ground and measure with our mobile lab. And then we have a company that flies over all the sites with an aircraft. And we take all that data and try to understand it perfectly and put it into an emission model that now has these big events and smaller events. And what we're seeing is we're really coming close to closure. And so we're doing this first in kind of the Denver, Greeley, Fort Collins area, what they call the DJ Basin. And then we'll be moving up to Wyoming starting next spring. And we'll be doing the same thing in the Upper Green River Basin. So that's an exciting project. And some people may have heard the Department of Energy just released $480 million for more methane mitigation nationally.
Yeah.
And
those
so
are behemoth projects, by the way,
that's a lot of money for
lot,
this. Yeah. So we're actually working with CSU and other collaborators to put together a couple proposals that would be really exciting if we get them. And now we're moving from just measuring methane to offering solutions to producers. So
good.
Hopefully we'll get those grants.
And so let's go to the SABRE project that is focused on the DJ Basin. If I remember correctly, this is a plug to the model of the School of Energy Resources. Shane, help me out. I think that project, you weren't going to be able to do any work in Wyoming, but we were able to come in and help amplify that project so you could do research on both sides of the border. Is that right?
Yep, absolutely. So our partners in Colorado State, they just wanted to focus on the Denver-Julesburg Basin. They were interested in doing other work because they actually work a lot with the producers in Wyoming, but they didn't have enough money in the budget. So School of Energy Resources added a little bit of money to the budget, and that allowed us to move up into Wyoming, and it was just a win-win for everyone.
Yeah.
And I think it helped get the project funded because I think it was a far more interesting proposal to the federal government when it was more than just one basin that. And some people have said the DJ Basin is the most overstudied basin in the country. We could debate that, but it is definitely highly studied, so they were excited to see it go other places.
Okay. Yeah. So it expanded to the Green River Basin.
Yes.
Okay. Great. That's great. And you can see, obviously, we don't like CSU when it comes to football, but we are two land grant institutions not too far apart, so it's great when we can collaborate on this kind of work.
Absolutely. I went to CU Boulder for an undergrad,
well,
so we hate
bad.
CSU and they hate CU Boulder. So it works
well,
great.
It's good when your alliances line up like that, actually. So, okay. So the center has worked on other projects. We focused today mostly on methane intensity or methane emissions mitigation and quantification. Do you want to talk about any of those other projects and explain benefits they could provide to Wyoming and the nation?
Yeah, so as we move forward here, we're submitting some of these proposals to this big methane mitigation call. And I think, as we get more and more involved with this, it's changing from measuring and understanding emissions to really going after mitigating. And so there's a lot of new technology that's coming on board. And our center, I'm kind of excited. I think our center is moving from one that's mainly measurement-based to one that's really integrating with companies and doing outreach and providing solutions. And then if we get this money from the federal government, providing actual equipment to mitigate the emissions. So.
And it's just you've already had a big impact, but it can continue to grow.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Some of the grants we're putting in right now are focused on marginal wells, which is a big deal for Wyoming.
Yeah.
We have a lot of producers that have wells that don't produce huge amounts. And, for better or worse, the federal government has really been going after those wells because they do tend to emit more methane per methane produced. And so it's exciting that we might have opportunities to work with these producers and reduce their emissions so they can keep operating because I think that's a priority for the state is to help the small companies keep going.
Yeah, and some of those are family companies, so it is really important to keep those wells producing. So on that, when should a family or a small company or a big company, anyone in Wyoming or beyond, when should they contact the Center for Air Quality?
Anytime they want to. We're really open to any projects. Because of support from SER, we have some operating budget to go out and do tests or look at things with people. So yeah, we love it when producers and operators reach out. It's great. It helps grow our interaction with the industry, and it actually helps us go out and look for grant money, because every time we can say we have these connections, then whoever's giving the grants is more excited to fund us because they know that our work goes into real change, not just academic papers.
Exactly. You're not just doing research for the sake of research.
Right.
You're working with the actual producers. So if a high school student or early college student wanted to get in this field, what would you tell them to study?
Yeah,
how do you get into this?
That's a great question. This is a weird field, right? Because it kind of combines, I was a chemical engineer.
Yeah.
A lot of people in this field are civil and mechanical engineers. Some are atmospheric scientists. Some are meteorologists. So I would just tell them to study something they enjoy that has math in it for sure. And then, I have colleagues that are in mechanical engineering, civil engineering, chemistry, physics, and meteorology departments. So you can really come at this from a lot of ways, and everyone ends up learning on the fly no matter what. And so, yeah, I would just say pick a major that sounds interesting to you. And
has math.
And has
Got
math.
that. Yeah.
Got to do math.
Got to do math if you want to be in atmospheric sciences.
And these days, you got to learn how to computer code. That's just ubiquitous. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good to know. So for our last questions, we always like to ask folks and let our listeners learn a little bit more about you. So what is your favorite place to visit in Wyoming?
Yeah. I remember you told me you would ask me this, and I forgot to do my homework. There are so many places in Wyoming we like going. I think some of the more, our family really likes going to Thermopolis. My kids love the hot springs there. I really like going to Yellowstone, although we now have an observational site there, so we go there a little bit too much. But I just love honestly, in Laramie, I just love going just east of town here and mountain biking. We have so much amazing around us. And
exactly. You don't have to go far.
You don't have to go far, but every part of the state we visited. And one great thing about the research we do is it takes us all over the state.
Yeah.
And, sometimes I just stand out there like in the Upper Green River Basin. We're looking at the Wind River Range, and it's just beautiful. The whole state's amazing.
It is.
Yeah.
So what's one thing you'd like folks to know about you?
About me?
Nothing.
I think just related to the Center for Air Quality is we're just out to try to, I think it's a real win-win. It's been exciting because I think a lot of times there's this impression that, research is versus industry is versus politicians. And this has been exciting because, if we can reduce emissions, that helps everyone. And so we're just all on the same team, and that's been exciting. And it's been exciting to work with all these companies because it really teaches you from an academic point that they're trying to mitigate the best they can. So I think what I would like people to know is that the Center for Air Quality is just out there to try to help everyone out, and there's no real agenda other than that.
Has it surprised you from when you were early academic and you met the first industry partners that you've been working with for a decade now? Has their level of commitment and engagement surprised you?
I think it has. I think we've been really impressed. Sometimes we go out and we'll do a project, and our industry partner will be emailing us at 6:00 after we just got back home from the field and asking us the little details so they can go fix them the next day. They're really, really proactive about fixing these things.
Well, Shane, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for all you do for SER, for UW, for Wyoming, for our industry, and for the nation and the world. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks, Holly, for doing a great job at SER.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Energy Frontier, the Wyoming Landscape, the podcast that highlights the School of Energy Resources at the University of Wyoming. You can expect a new episode of Energy Frontier every Wednesday on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. See you next time.